The small town of Willis, Texas, was quiet, its dirt roads lined with modest homes and the occasional storefront. In one of those homes, a young boy named Bernard Garrett sat on the porch, watching the men in suits walk past. They weren't rich, but they held power: shop owners, landowners, men who controlled their own destiny. Bernard wanted that too. Even as a child, Bernard saw the world differently. He didn't just see buildings, he saw opportunities. He noticed how people struggled, how some lived in large homes while others barely got by. And he asked the questions no one else dared to ask. Why? Why did some men own property while others only rented? Why did some businesses thrive while others failed? And most importantly, why did the color of a man's skin decide how far he could go? His parents worked hard, scraping together a living like so many others in the segregated South. Schools were separate, jobs were limited, and ambition often clashed with reality. But Bernard wasn't afraid of dreaming big. While other boys played in the fields, he listened, really listened, to the men who owned businesses. He studied how they spoke, how they made deals. At just 11 years old, he had an idea. If I can't find opportunity, I'll create it. By the time he was a teenager, Bernard had already dipped his toes into business. He started a shoe-shining stand, then expanded into a cleaning service. He worked tirelessly, determined to rise above the limitations placed on him. But the world around him was unrelenting. No matter how hard he worked, there were lines he couldn't cross, doors that refused to open. Texas was suffocating. The deep roots of segregation ensured that no black man, no matter how smart or hardworking, could truly own his success. And Bernard refused to accept that. So, in 1945, with little more than ambition in his pocket, he made a decision that would change everything. He was leaving Texas. With his wife Eunice and their young children beside him, Bernard stepped onto a train bound for California. The future was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. If there was a way to beat the system, he was going to find it. The train rattled along the tracks, carrying Bernard Garrett toward a future he couldn't yet see. The sun faded behind him, taking Texas with it, but his mind was already racing ahead, to California, to new beginnings, to possibilities that felt just out of reach. He wasn't afraid of the unknown. If anything, he welcomed it. Los Angeles in 1945 was a different world. Skyscrapers stretched high, cars flooded the streets, and opportunity pulsed through the air. It wasn't paradise. Racism still lurked in the corners, waiting to trip up men like him, but it was better than Texas. Here, he wasn't just a black man fighting against a system designed to hold him back. He was a man with a plan. Bernard wasted no time. With a few dollars in his pocket and a family to support, he did what he knew best: hustled. He started small, launching another cleaning service. While most people scrubbed floors to get by, Bernard saw something more. He learned his customers, understood what they needed, and built relationships. Before long, he wasn't just cleaning buildings. He was gaining access to men who owned them. But owning a cleaning business wasn't the goal. Owning buildings was. He saved every penny he could, his mind always running calculations. How much did buildings cost? How much rent could they generate? What made property values rise? His questions turned into knowledge, and that knowledge turned into a burning obsession. One day, standing on a busy Los Angeles street, he made a promise to himself. I'm not just going to rent buildings. I'm going to own this city. Ambition wasn't enough. Bernard needed money. And in post-war America, banks weren't lending to black men. He had two choices: give up or find another way. He chose the second. His break came in the form of a junk business. He noticed waste paper, used newspapers, cardboard, scraps, piling up everywhere. It was worthless to most people. But Bernard saw money. He started collecting it, selling it in bulk to recycling plants. The profits weren't huge, but they were steady. Day by day, his savings grew. And then came his first chance at real estate. A small, run-down apartment building was on the market. Cheap. Most investors ignored it. But Bernard had learned something important. Wealthy investors didn't buy ugly buildings, but ugly buildings could make money. With every cent he had, he scraped together a down payment. The moment he signed, he wasn't just a tenant anymore. He was a landlord. The moment was electric. He had crossed a line few men like him had ever crossed. But as he stared at the faded paint, the broken windows, and the crumbling walls, he knew this was just the beginning. He couldn't afford to fail. He had tenants to attract, repairs to make, and a reputation to build. And most of all, he had an entire system to outsmart. Bernard Garrett stood in front of his first apartment building, the ink still fresh on the deed. The structure was nothing special. Cracked sidewalks, peeling paint, and tenants barely making ends meet. But to Bernard, it was more than just a building. It was proof. Proof that he could cross a line most men like him weren't even allowed to approach. Proof that he could play the game of real estate and win. But winning wouldn't be easy. Even as a landlord, the system was still stacked against him. Real estate agents refused to show him better properties. Banks turned him away the moment they saw his face, and white landlords kept their properties out of his reach. The rules weren't fair, but Bernard had never been interested in playing fair. One evening, after being denied yet another real estate deal, Bernard sat in a cafe, deep in thought. That's when he met him, Barker. Barker was a white real estate investor who had his own reasons for wanting to make money fast. But unlike the others, he didn't care who he was working with, as long as the money was real. Bernard saw his chance. He proposed a deal. Barker would be the face, but Bernard would be the mind. Barker would attend the meetings, sign the papers, and negotiate the deals while Bernard ran the business from the shadows. And just like that, the game changed. The plan worked better than either of them expected. Barker walked into meetings, shook hands, and closed deals, while Bernard pulled the strings behind the scenes. One building became two. Two became 10. Bernard bought apartment complexes in white neighborhoods where no one would sell to a black man. Once he owned them, he rented them to black families, giving them better housing than they had ever known. Word spread. Other investors started to notice, and not all of them were happy. A black man was winning in their world, and that was unacceptable. Then came the threats. Letters slid under his door, warning him to stop. Anonymous calls hissed through the phone line. But Bernard wasn't afraid. He wasn't just buying buildings. He was buying freedom. And he was just getting started. The air in Los Angeles had shifted. Bernard Garrett was no longer a small-time landlord. He was a force. By 1954, his portfolio had grown beyond what anyone had expected. Apartment buildings, rental units, his empire stretched across the city. But Bernard wasn't satisfied. He wasn't playing for small wins. He wanted to own the game. That meant moving beyond residential properties. If he wanted real power, he needed to buy commercial real estate. And not just any building. He wanted the tallest one in Los Angeles. The Bankers Building loomed over downtown LA, a symbol of wealth and power. It was the kind of property that black businessmen weren't even allowed to set foot in, let alone own. But Bernard wasn't interested in permission. He partnered with Joseph B. Morris, a successful black businessman who shared his vision. Together, they put together the capital. The only problem? No seller would ever agree to sell it to them. So, Bernard went back to what worked. He and Morris hired white associates to act as their public representatives. These men walked into the negotiation rooms, posed as the buyers, and shook hands with sellers who had no idea they were actually doing business with two black men. And then, the unthinkable happened. The deal closed. Bernard and Morris owned the tallest building in Los Angeles. But power came with a price. Owning the banker's building wasn't just a victory. It was a warning shot. The old money elites of Los Angeles had tolerated Bernard's rise as long as it stayed in the shadows. But this was too much. Real estate moguls and bankers whispered behind closed doors. Who was this man? How had he beaten them at their own game? Bernard knew what was coming. He had rattled the system, and the system was going to push back. He just didn't know how hard. But he wasn't going to stop. Because his next move? He was coming for the banks. Bernard Garrett had done the impossible. He had taken control of the tallest building in Los Angeles without anyone realizing a black man owned it. But while others celebrated, he was already thinking ahead. Owning buildings gave him power. Owning banks would give him control. For years, Bernard had watched black entrepreneurs struggle to secure loans. Redlining and discriminatory banking practices kept African Americans locked out of financial success. No matter how smart or hardworking they were, they couldn't access the money needed to grow businesses or buy homes. Bernard knew that had to change, but change required action. And that meant doing something no black man had ever done before. He had to own a bank. Real estate had made him rich, but banks required a different strategy. He and his business partner, Joseph B. Morris, started scouting for financial institutions they could take over. Their eyes landed on Texas. Texas banks were struggling. Small-town institutions were bleeding money, desperate for buyers. Bernard knew he could step in, but only if he moved carefully. So, he went back to his most trusted strategy. Use white associates as the face, while he pulled the strings from behind the scenes. Through a series of front men, Bernard and Morris acquired the Mainland Bank and Trust Company and the First National Bank of Marlin. Suddenly, they controlled the flow of money in places where black communities had never had financial power. And that's when everything changed. For the first time, black farmers, business owners, and families could get loans without facing racial discrimination. The banks started approving mortgages for black families in areas where they had never been allowed to buy homes. Small black-owned businesses finally had access to capital. Bernard and Morris weren't just making money. They were rewriting the rules of the financial system. But when you change the game, the people who built it will do everything in their power to stop you. The success of their banks didn't go unnoticed. The moment the establishment realized that black men owned these financial institutions, they started looking for ways to take them down. In 1965, Bernard and Morris were accused of misapplying bank funds, a vague charge that authorities often used against minority business owners who threatened the status quo. They were accused of improperly moving $189,000, a fraction of what white bankers did routinely, without consequence. But this wasn't about money. It was about control. The courts didn't hesitate. Bernard and Morris were sentenced to 3 years in prison. After just 9 months, they were released. But by then, the damage had been done. Their banks were gone. Their financial empire was dismantled. The system had struck back. But Bernard wasn't finished. Because legacies don't die. Prison doors may have closed behind Bernard Garrett, but his mind was already beyond them. He had spent 9 months behind bars, but the system hadn't broken him. It had only confirmed what he already knew. Power wasn't given. It had to be taken. By the time he walked free, everything had changed. The buildings he had fought for, the banks he had controlled, they were gone. His name had been dragged through courtrooms, his financial empire dismantled. Most men would have disappeared. Bernard Garrett wasn't most men. The world had moved on. But Bernard never stopped thinking like a businessman. Even though he never regained the financial dominance he once had, he continued working in real estate, using the knowledge he had built over decades to navigate new ventures. Money could be taken, but knowledge was permanent. Though he stayed away from the public eye, his story couldn't be erased. Because what he had done, what he and Joseph B. Morris had built, was bigger than money. They had cracked the system in ways no one thought possible. They had used the very rules designed to keep black men out and turned them into weapons of power. They had proven that economic freedom was possible, even in a world built against them. And that was something no court could take away. For years, Bernard's name faded from history. He passed away in 1999, without the recognition he deserved. But stories like his don't stay buried. In 2020, the world finally took notice. Hollywood turned his life into a film, The Banker. The story of how he outplayed the system, how he built an empire in the shadows, and how he paved the way for generations to come, reached audiences across the globe. People who had never heard his name suddenly knew the man who had beaten the odds. Bernard Garrett never got to see the impact of his story on the world. But his legacy? It never stopped growing. Because the greatest success isn't just making money. It's making history.